Hello, beautiful, beautiful souls, beautiful light beings of brilliance. I'm so excited to have you on the Soulful Self podcast. And I'm even more excited to introduce the guest of today's show. Christian De La Huerta is a best-selling author, a speaker, a breathwork practitioner. He is a transformational life coach, and honestly, so much more. He grew up in Cuba, at least for the first part of his childhood, under the Fidel Castro regime, where he felt not very free. Him and his family emigrated, which caused a whole bunch of stigma for him in his life. And this is something that he talks about in his latest book entitled Awakening the Soul of Power: How to Live Heroically and Set Yourself Free. There is so much value in this book. He actually sent me a copy and I got to read it. He talks all about the ego, which can be a very loaded concept, what it means to live through the lens of an unhealed ego versus the healed ego, which is what we aspire to when we look inside and do our healing work, our shadow work, our inner child work, and all of the things. Breath work. He is a breathwork practitioner and coach. He's been doing it for 30 years, and for him it's all about results, right? You can't argue with results, and breathwork has definitely been a huge healing modality for him and his clients. We also talk about topics of masculinity and femininity, as in the divine sense, divine masculine and divine feminine, how we are completely out of balance with those concepts as a society, and how it proves detrimental not only towards women but also for men who feel like they cannot express their emotions because being emotional has been labeled as weak in our culture. So we discuss so many different topics, and they're all super insightful, informative, beneficial. I just can't wait for y'all to hear them. So without further ado, let's welcome Christian De La Huerta onto the Soulful Self podcast. All right. Welcome to the Soulful Self podcast. I am here with best-selling author, speaker, breathwork practitioner, and personal transformation coach, Christian De La Huerta. Christian, welcome to the Soulful Self podcast. How are you today?
Hey, Charles. I'm doing great. Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to having a conversation with you.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to have you here. You recently came out with your Amazon best-selling book, Awakening the Soul of Power, which I have with me right here. And we're
Excellent.
going to get into it. There are so many powerful concepts for anyone looking to better themselves, looking to step into their soulful self, and really anyone going through a spiritual awakening even. So I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience a little bit by covering some things about your background, your upbringing, what it was like for you.
Yeah, that's a good question because I'm an unlikely person to be writing about what it means to live a heroic life and personal power. I was raised in Cuba for the first 10 years of my life, so in a communist dictatorial regime, and to be having even a thought about personal power in that kind of setting where the state pretty much owns you and tells you what to do, it's kind of laughable. And I was also raised in a very Catholic family, so I mean, with all due respect to the tradition, it's also a very hierarchical power structure, where power's from above, and you have the Pope and the cardinals and the archbishops and the bishops, etc. And again, you're told what to believe and what's right and what's wrong. And my adolescence was one long depression. It was just, I mean, as I struggled with my sense of identity and who I was and what I was doing here, and so again, unlikely person to be talking about personal empowerment. But the good news is that the reason that I find the book a valid message is that using the teachings and the concepts that I share about in the book, it's like these days, no matter the details in my life, no matter the circumstances, whether a relationship works out or doesn't, whether a project succeeds or it fails, in quotes, never ever do I question my sense of self. And like I said, I know self-doubt, I know self-hatred. So I know that all this stuff from our past can be healed, and it can be transformed, and it can be transcended.
Yes, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. That's so true. And I think that those of us who struggle the most with our self identity and self acceptance and personal empowerment can be the ones who have the deepest transformations in
Yeah,
life.
I think you're right. I think there's something to that.
Mhm.
Um, and I think having to face, those deep existential questions that I think most of us end up facing at some point. Who am I, and what am I doing here, and what do I want to do with this life that goes by so fast?
Mm.
For some of us, we circumstances in life, we started asking those questions earlier on, and yeah, it was difficult in adolescence, and I'm grateful for it because in a way that gives you a little bit of a head start.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. It's like we have to go through all the bullshit in a really short period and it sucks. It's super painful, but it leads to a breakthrough, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I can relate to that 100%.
Yeah.
So, speaking of the concept of self, something that you talk a lot about in your book is, of course, the ego. And I was wondering if you could provide our listeners with your definition of what the ego actually is.
Yeah, and that's a really important question. And we don't have time to really dive into it in an hour interview.
Okay.
Like when I do my retreats, I spend probably the whole first morning talking about that because it's really critical. And the thing is that there's a lot of confusion about what the ego is. Most of us
Mm.
who know the word will think arrogance, inflated sense of self, and it is that, but it's a lot more than that. And then maybe if we took Psych 101 in college, we might think, Freud's model of personality, the id, the ego, the superego, and there's some things that overlap and that apply, but mostly the way that I'm talking about ego is more derived from Eastern teachings, and it's a sense of self, like you're saying. It's a part of our mind that makes sense of sensory information that would otherwise be completely overwhelming. It can reach back into the past. It can project into the future, and somehow it weaves all of that into a coherent personality, a sense of self. Like this is Christian, that's Chess over there, right?
Mhm.
So it's ultimately an illusion, and it's both a leap in evolution, and it's a source of all our suffering. So so experts who write about this, like Ken Wilber, talks about how humanity hasn't always had a sense of self. Like at some point, we always, like all the other creatures, we felt at one with, like part of all creation. So
Mhm.
having that in the sense of individual personality was a leap in evolution. It's part of the reason we're so successful as a species, and it's also the source of our pain and our suffering. Because once we have that sense of individual identity, of a separate identity, now we can have, feel we can feel abandoned, we can feel lonely, we can feel separate and alone. We have abandonment issues. We can have a sense of our own mortality, and so those are kind of the price we pay for having a sense of individual identity. And here's a great metaphor that to help understand is what the ego is. If you put a baseball in the center of a stadium, that's what the ego is. That's what that part of our minds is. Who we are is actually the stadium. And we've allowed this tiny, tiny, tiny part of who we are to think that it is all of who we are, and to make some really important, consequential choices about our lives, about our relationships, about what we do from its very small, limited, and always fear based perspective. So if we want to have relationships that have a chance at working, if we want to have a sense of personal empowerment, if we want to have a life that is filled with meaning, with purpose, it's really important to understand what the ego is so that we can free ourselves from its self-made prison. And so that's why I spent probably the first quarter of the book talking about that and helping people understand what it is and how it keeps us in limited, fear-based prison.
Yeah, definitely. It can be a very deep and complicated subject to answer what exactly is the ego, but I love your analogy of the baseball field. And actually, we are the whole entire stadium. What the imagery that comes to mind for me is like, okay, I am in this singular body here on earth, but when I connect deeper to the truth of who I am, I find that I am everything. I'm one with the ocean, with the sky, the stars, the trees, with other beings, right? And I think that we can talk about it all day long. Psychology has its own idea of what the ego is, spirituality has another idea, but until we have that experiential understanding of going within, it can be very difficult to grasp as a concept.
Yes. And even when we have experiences like the ones you're talking about, when we experience that sense of oneness with everything, like many people do through either breathwork experiences or shamanic experiences or sacred plant medicine work, where you break through the filters of the ego and then have that experience of who we are as interconnected to it all. Those experiences are great and they're undeniable. And sometimes we just don't have the language because it's beyond, those experiences are beyond the limitation of the logic understanding or skeptical little minds. And so it's still, a process to navigate.
Yeah,
As you
absolutely.
know.
Of course. Yeah, it's an endless process, right? Yeah. And it is what I hear you saying almost is that our human mind almost is not capable of comprehending the vastness of it all because it's such a non-human phenomenon that we're trying to reach into. And I think that's where religion a lot of times can fall short, is because it's like this human way to define a non-human thing. And people get so wholeheartedly subscribed to it that it becomes our own detriment. And that's something that you talk a lot about, right? Religion versus spirituality.
Yeah. And with all due respect, like I honor all the traditions. I think all the traditions have a valid path to God or the sacred or whatever you want to call it. And so to the degree that each of the, so I honor them all and I also challenge them all.
Mm-hmm.
Because to the degree that they're helping us reconnect with that nature, that stadium nature that we're talking about, that is part of it all, that is interconnected to it all. To the degree that a certain path is helping us to become more compassionate, better human beings, then they're doing their job. And to the degree that they're fostering fear and separation and what I call a theological pissing contest, my God is bigger than yours, and there how many wars have been fought because of that, then that's the part that needs challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love how you're able to look through it with a lens of compassion and also see the good that comes from it, in congruency with its limitations.
Yeah.
So going back to the ego, if we are kind of viewing it as this identity, right? This thing that we're very identified with, our sense of self, all these layers of externality that make up who I am, my preferences, my past, my conception of my future, all of those things. Why is it important, or how can it be important to disidentify with the ego?
Yeah, that's a great question. And because its perceptions are always going to be limited. Like it's always going to see things through a filter. And the ego, like there are a lot of behaviors that stem from the ego. So the ego is very defensive. It takes everything personally. It's always in reactive mode. Like when it takes everything personally, then it reacts. And you did this to me, well, I'm gonna get you back and do that to you. And it's stuck in that. It has a kind of unhealthy need to be right. And that's one of the reasons we get in so many arguments and so many power struggles with each other, because it's this, that the egos need to be right. It's stuck. It's very judgmental. It's very self-righteous. So, I joke around that the ego went to law school and appoints itself a judge, jury, prosecutor, all into one. It knows exactly what the other person did that was wrong, and sometimes what the punishment should be, and delivers the punishment. So that's that self-righteousness of the ego. And it's a lonely place to be. It's the separation that is the source of so much of our pain. It's also always stuck in victim mode. Poor me, woe is me. If only, right? If it only hadn't been for mom doing this, or daddy who didn't do that, or the teacher or the minister or society, or sexism or racism or homophobia. If only, then I would be happy. Then I would be successful. And the thing is, if we're on a journey of empowerment, of personal empowerment, as long as we're holding anyone or anything, any system outside of us responsible for our state of being, we just give our power away. And it's not to deny, like things happen that shouldn't have happened, or that people fell short of the mark, and that humans cause harm to each other. It's not denying any of that, and it's not denying that the system is set up unfairly right now, so that some groups have advantage over others. I think that's pretty undeniable. And it's not to deny that there's a lack of equity between the men and women, between the masculine and the feminine in our world today. So it's not denying any of that, but it's saying that if we want to step into our power, we have to, like, at some point realize, you know what? It sucked that happened, whatever it was. And how am I going to show up in response to it? Because one thing we know for sure is that life is going to continue throwing curveballs our way. Like that we know, and we're not going to see them coming. Mm-hmm. Like a global pandemic. Maybe 5 people in the world saw that coming, right? And so that we can count on. But just reframing this in the way that we're talking about, where no matter what happened in the past, no matter what happens going forward, we always get to choose how we're going to show up in response. That alone, that reframe, that rethinking, that holding it in that way pops us out of that victim consciousness, the victim mindset of the ego. And it begins that journey of empowerment. And it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy, but it's so true. It's so empowering to know that we are ultimately in control. And in this present moment, I have a choice on how I can respond. I can stay in the habitual ways that I've always responded that have gotten me to the conditions that I now find myself in, which are the ones that I might be complaining about that are not so good, or I can stop and do something differently to get a different result, right?
Exactly.
That's very powerful.
That's it. Because we get stuck in these power struggles and in these patterns of relationship that are really self-defeating and self-sabotaging. Sometimes we get stuck in relationships that, if we get honest, it feels like the same boring movie, maybe with a different actor, a different co-lead, but it's the same crap, the same shit, same patterns coming up, the same arguments, the same issues, just with a different actor. And so at some point, we got to get honest and say, wait a minute, who is the one constant, the one common denominator in every one of those arguments, in every one of those relationships? It's right here. So why am I attracting that kind of stuff? Why am I creating that kind of stuff? So that we can get off that boring merry-go-round of they do this, I do that, they do this, boring. We've done it 1,000 times. So how do we reclaim our power and get ourselves off this merry-go-round of repetitive, boring, tired behavior patterns?
Yes, I love that so much. And it really does take a level of awareness for people to even realize that the same themes, the same life lessons are presenting themselves to them over and over again, just with different stage set, different actors, right? Different scenery. Right. And I've heard you give a really awesome example of this when you talked about how you were in partnerships that you repeatedly were cheated on. Right. Yeah. And it wasn't until you had this realization that you were cheating your parents by not being honest and open with them about your sexuality.
Yes. Yeah. So that was a great example from my personal life that I think I talk about in the book, or
on another podcast, I think.
It's another podcast.
Yeah.
So my first 3 relationships, there was that pattern of getting cheated on. I didn't find out about it until afterwards. So once I started doing this work, which is holding us accountable for, like in the like ultimate sense. We're like, Carl Jung talks about how we attract people into our lives and we create situations so that we see unhealed patterns in ourselves, areas that are in need of healing, that are blind spots that we're never going to see, but we can sure see them over there or see them in a pattern of relationship. And so, once I started teaching about understanding the ego, about freeing ourselves, about how do we do that, and understanding these patterns of relationships, it's like I realized, wait a minute, I was out to my siblings and I was out to my close friends, but I hadn't really come out to my parents. And I could rationalize why, because I would tell myself, it was like, they don't really need to know. If you give them a shot of sodium pentothal, the truth serum, is like, they know. And that was true. I think they really did know, because parents know deep down inside. But I think I was using that excuse of I didn't want to cause them any pain or any hurt as an excuse not to have a difficult conversation with them, a challenging conversation. And so I realized that, like you said, that I was also cheating. Right? So the pattern that was being repeated in my life, I was also doing. Different circumstances, different details, but the dynamic is the same. I was cheating my relationship with my parents by withholding a huge part of who I am. I mean, it's not the biggest part of who I am by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a significant part. So, if they ask me, what are you doing this weekend, or what did you do last weekend, I'd have to make something up or lie. And that's not the kind of relationship I want to have with my parents. Arguably my most significant relationship, the most constant one in my life. And so I came out to them and I cleaned that up. I cleared that up. My next relationships ever since, so I was in an ashram for 5 years, so I wasn't in a relationship during that time, but I was mostly celibate, for those 5 years.
Wow,
But I know, it's crazy. It's crazy. If you would have told me I was going to do that, I would have laughed or cried.
Okay, maybe both.
Maybe both, because I just didn't think I would be able to do that.
Yeah.
But you know what? It was such a difficult situation, like in a existential way, in deeper ways, that wasn't even the hardest part of it. But anyway, coming out of that ashram experience, and for people who may not know, an ashram is like a spiritual community, mostly Eastern based. Kind of a monastic is another word that we can use, like monastic experience, except I wasn't going out, I didn't go out to the Himalayas and get away from society. It was kind of an urban setting where I was doing the work. But anyway, coming out of that after 5 years, and every relationship I've had since, I've never, ever been cheated on again.
Wow. That's incredible.
I know. I mean, different shit came up, of course, because
Always.
we're always working out stuff.
Yeah, definitely. That's beautiful to hear that story, because I think it just inspires a lot of hope for us. And it's also a perfect example of how energy works. Everything in the universe is energy. They say only what you are withholding in a situation can be lacking, right? So we just don't, like, we're so used to categorizing, right? We're like, I have my work life and I have my romantic life, I have my friendships and I have my spiritual life. But the universe doesn't work like that. It's all energy. So if you're doing something in your work life that's out of integrity, it's going to show up in your relationships or somewhere else. And so taking the time to be introspective and say, okay, this thing is happening to me. I'm being cheated on, or my boundaries are being violated, or whatever the case may be, then we have the opportunity to examine every other area of our life and say, where am I putting this energy out? And that's when we can find the solution.
Exactly. I mean, and so much wisdom in what you just said. And to be really, really clear again for your audience, it doesn't make it okay, right? It doesn't rationalize the cheating. It doesn't make it okay that they did that. It doesn't mean that we have to stay in those relationships. But it does mean that if we want to be free and we're beginning to see patterns, that at some point we got to get honest and see, like, wait a minute, why am I attracting this kind of person who cheats? What is my part in that? What is my role in that? And the other thing you said, I think is very important, is that it all begins with self-awareness. because we can't do anything about what we're not aware of. If we can't see it, we don't even know how it's having an impact on our lives and our relationships from the subconscious, which is kind of a tragic thing, because we're so conditioned to be afraid of the emotions. We're like, our society is so ADD, and we're so distracted by all the aspects of life, and we are brilliant at numbing ourselves out, and so that we don't think and we don't feel, and so we numb out in all the brilliant creative ways that we do so, whether it's substances, drugs, or alcohol, or whether it's sex that some people use to not feel and not think, workaholism, social media, TV, shopping, even exercise can be a way to numb out and to run away from ourselves. But the thing about, to realize, the sooner we realize that we can't run away from that stuff. It's like they don't go away, right? The stuff that we try to sweep under the rug, it doesn't go away. And it only starts getting bigger and growing under the surface, and it starts having an impact on our lives, on our relationships, even our health, if we let it go on long enough. So it's that's why this book is part of the series that I call Calling All Heroes, because this takes work. Like what we're talking about takes work, right? It takes courage to go within and to look at ourselves and to ask ourselves, why do we do the things we do? And why do we attract this certain kind of relationship? And why do I have a tendency to sabotage myself or to sabotage my relationship, sometimes even before we get going, by falling for people who are not available, people who are not a match? And it's not to put anybody down. It doesn't mean we're better or worse. It's not a match for either where we are in life, for our values, what we want from life, our dreams. It's just not a match. Self-awareness. So, there needs to be a little bit of a match in self-awareness.
Right. Absolutely. And it's like, there are definitely incompatibilities when I am an emotionally available person and I tend to fall for emotionally unavailable people. But also on an energetic level, what I like to say a lot is that it is an energetic match, because we're always attracting to us people who are reflecting our own sense of self-worth. Right. Yes. And so, like everything you're saying, when we stop numbing out, when we stop avoiding all the things that we resist that will persist and get bigger, right? When we face it, that's when we can really heal ourselves and up level our sense of self-worth, and then have access to all those beautiful partnerships that really are in alignment and are fulfilling, and beautiful relationships, job opportunities, etc.
Oh my God, beautiful, beautifully framed. And that's, so yeah, it's difficult to look inside ourselves and to face our demons, our own demons, but it is so worthwhile, because freedom becomes possible. And so that we can start making choices, like authentic choices in our lives, rather than making choices from the subconscious, because the stuff that happened to us when we were 5 or 7. And here's just one example that I run across a lot. People who, like, there are a lot of divorced families. And so if our parents got divorced, and when we were, say, 5 or 7 or whatever, 10, those young minds that don't know any better don't have a context for understanding that, right? So we personalize things. Those little egos that don't even know their egos take things personally. So it's like, oh my God, how could daddy leave, or how could mommy leave us? And without understanding that it had nothing to do with us. Like, who knows what was going on in their mind? Who knows what was going on in their relationship? Who knows what subconscious stuff was going on from the way that they were parented and their parents before that, and the way the beliefs they have about relationships and their own fears about that, and their own traumas that were not healed or resolved. It's like all that stuff going on, but we make it about us. And then the next level down is like, well, what does it mean about me that daddy or mommy left? It's like, wow, there must be something wrong with me. I must not be good enough. I must not be lovable enough. Like, all a misunderstanding, just a misunderstanding. But it's really tragic if we're not willing to do the work of looking at those things, because if not, they're going to continue impacting from the subconscious. If we have that belief that we're not good enough, or that there's something wrong with us, that's what we're going to attract in relationship.
Yeah,
somebody
absolutely.
who's going to mirror that.
100%. Absolutely. All of the things that are imprinted on our psyche at a young age. And Yeah, sometimes we look back and it could definitely be described as a misunderstanding. And really, it's this lack of emotional intelligence and emotional awareness, because what happens when we're that young is it becomes an unprocessed emotional experience. But if we have people in our lives who are able to help us move through those emotions, then we can release them in the spot instead of holding on to them and packing them away in our subconscious for years. And so I think that's part of the mission of people like you and me on this planet, is to raise that spiritual emotional awareness so that we know how to handle our inner worlds.
Sure. For sure. And
Yeah.
you know, and part of it begins with that conditioning that we've labeled the emotions weakness. Somewhere along the way,
Mm.
somebody decided that to feel was weakness. It's like, wait a minute, what a faulty assumption. Because what
Mhm.
used to be spiritual teaching, that everything is energy, now we know from quantum physics that it's true. It's all energy. That means our bodies, even though they feel solid, they're just energy. They're just vibration, everything, including the emotions. And that's what happens when we stuff those emotions, when we don't allow ourselves to feel an emotion, when we override it because we're afraid that if we really said something about how we're feeling, that it would cause conflict. There would be, it's like it would cause confrontation, and we're terrified of that. So we stuff all those emotions, and yet that stuff doesn't go away, and it only
Mm.
continues to get worse. Because what happens is, after years of suppressing our emotions, we walk around with layers upon layers upon layers of repressed emotional crap. And so the
Mhm.
emotions aren't good, they're not bad, they're not strength, they're not weakness, they're just energies. And like, if you think of a kid, when a kid has a total meltdown, a total tantrum, 2 minutes later, they're playing like if nothing happened, right? Because they have their emotions fully. They don't stuff them. We're the one
Mhm.
that get it. We're the ones that get in trouble with emotions because we stuff them. And then what happens is, when we stuff anger, it turns into rage, and we walk around like raging cauldrons. And then the least thing can just cause a volcanic eruption, um, inappropriate to the situation, and we cause harm to our relationships. And if we suppress sadness, it freezes, it congeals, and turns into depression. And then we live in a society where we medicate depression rather than looking at the source of it. And I'm
Mhm.
not saying that there are some cases of biochemical imbalance in the brain that does require medication. That they do exist, but by far, I don't know what the numbers are, but I would venture to guess that 90% at least are situational depression. That if we were willing to do our work and get into the source of what's going on, and work through it, we wouldn't need to be medicated. And again, not suggesting that anybody gets off their meds, right? Do you
Yeah.
always do that consulting your physician about that? But we are recommending that you look inside and be willing to ask the hard questions, because yeah, it'll be uncomfortable for a bit, and we'll look at stuff that's not pleasant to look at and remember, but it is so worthwhile, because then we can be free, and we can make those
Mhm.
choices like we were talking about before, from a place of freedom. Because what happens is, when we walk around with these bags of unexpressed emotions, we start dumping them in each other's lives, and here we think we're having a relationship in the present. It's all getting filtered through that lifetime of unhealed trauma and repressed emotions. Like, how any relationships can work boggles my mind, because we haven't been taught how to hold them, how to approach them. And we certainly haven't been taught how to clear that cauldron of suppressed emotions. But the good news is that there's a way that we can be taught about how to approach relationships, and that there are ways that we can clear those emotions quickly, like,
Mm.
with breath work and techniques like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really fascinated by the concept of breath work. It's something that I have a little bit of experience with, and I want to hear everything you have to say about it in just a minute. But I want to go back, because I heard you talking about we are filtering everything that we experience in this present moment through basically the traumas of our past. Right. And one thing that you also talk about when it comes to the unhealed ego, because there's the unhealed ego and the healed ego, which I think is important, because most of the time in spiritual circles, we talk about the ego in a negative context, but it
Yes,
also serves us in a lot of ways. So
absolutely.
part of the unhealed ego is the human shadow. And I was wondering if you could describe a little bit about that, how we project our shadow onto others, whatever information comes up for you around that.
Yeah, and that also Carl Jung, the psychologist, also speaks brilliantly about that. And
Mm-hmm.
basically, it's a concept called projection. It's a psychological defense mechanism when there's something in us that we are not ready to look at, so we're not ready to accept in ourselves. And so we stuff it in ourselves, we hide it in ourselves, but then we project it onto, and we see it and judge it and make it wrong over there. So, homophobia is a great example of that. How often do we see the political leaders, the religious leaders that are the loudest homophobes? Then those are the ones getting caught, with a call boy and crystal meth and, playing footsies in the bathroom stall at the airport, because we throw that stuff that we can't accept into ourselves into the dark recesses of a closet or a drawer somewhere, so that we don't want to deal with it. We can't. We're afraid of it. But again, that stuff doesn't go away. It's having an impact from the subconscious, and that's one of the reasons why we witness self-sabotaging behaviors, like the political leaders getting caught in stupid ways. That's what happens when we don't address it. The stuff that's in the subconscious. And so, and spiritual circles, like, which I imagine is the majority of the people listening to us, there's a thing called spiritual bypassing, where it's like, oh my God, everything is love and light. Namaste, you beautiful being. And maybe that's the ultimate truth, but we can't jump over the stuff in the shadow. Because it won't go away. We've got to be willing to wrestle it and to look at it. And so I wrote a piece a couple of years ago. You can't namaste the shadow away. Like, we got to be willing to work with it. And and once we do, then it's incredibly freeing and empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. Working with all those things that we suppress, reject, and deny about ourselves that, like you said, result in self-sabotage, because they're still a part of us. So they're going to come out in some way. And it's just like super uncontrolled and unmanageable the way that it comes out. So it's better to turn around and face it and integrate it so that we can be free and we can be more in control of our lives and our destiny. Yeah. So I imagine that breath work is a way to propel that integration.
Yeah. I've yet to come across, Chels, a more effective technique in healing that past trauma and clearing those suppressed emotions. And I've been doing it for, more than 30 years at this point. I was on a track to get a PhD in psychology. My dad was a psychiatrist, so I come out of that psychotherapy tradition. When I discovered breathwork, I jumped tracks. And because it works so fast and it heals so profoundly in so many ways. And with all due respect to the psychotherapy process, in the right hands with clear goals, it can be profoundly supportive and healing and transformational. And we all know you can sit on somebody's couch for 5, 10, 20, 30 years rehashing the same old crap and nothing happens. The reason for that is because understanding up here in the mind what happened to us when we were 5 or 10 or 15, whatever, is good. It definitely beats not being aware of it. But that trauma no longer lives in the mind. It's been somaticized. So it lives in the body. So going back to the everything is energy. So those emotional energies get suppressed and they get stuck in the body and the tissues of the body. And so it just doesn't go away. That's the importance of being willing to have the courage and the willingness. That's why it's the stuff of heroes to look at that stuff that sometimes it's scary. And breathwork is very effective. It bypasses the mind and it goes through those energy blocks in the body, and it clears them, and in very powerful ways.
So what would that look like? Like, what does a breathwork session look like practically?
Okay, so there's breathwork it's a big umbrella term. So there are a lot of different breathing practices and breathing techniques. Like anybody who's been to a yoga class knows that there's a lot of different techniques. Some are for relaxation, for sleeping better, other are more focusing on energizing. When I mean breathwork, it's a longer process. You breathe in a certain way, in a circular connected way for about an hour and a half. There's some practices that go longer, like even 3-4 hours.
Wow.
And just amazing stuff happens. Like really powerful. People have some really cathartic experiences, and recall stuff that's been suppressed, and heal it and actually clear it. And it's we don't have enough time. There's so many stories I have to say, because I have to share, because it heals so profoundly. In so many ways, like even physically. And I know that's too sounds too good to be true. That even 30 years of talking about it, when I hear myself saying that just from breathing, so much healing can happen, even physical. And on top of that, you can have some of those amazing unitary experiences that you and I were talking about, of a feeling of realizing that we are interconnected with it all and feel part with it all. That just from breathing, that can happen. But I can't argue with the results. It works.
Yeah.
And it has permanent effects.
Wow.
And
That's
part of the
beautiful.
reason is, like, the science isn't there yet in terms of understanding how it works. They haven't studied it the way that they've done so many studies and research on meditation, for example, and what's happening in our bodies when we meditate. I think they'll start doing that. But the way that I understand it from a psycho-spiritual perspective is if we think about, in most religions and most spiritual traditions in the world, the same word, one word, can mean spirit or breath, depending on the context. So, for example, from the ancient Greek pneuma, from which we get pneumonia, that word pneuma meant both lung and soul. And from the Latin spirare, we get both respiration and inspiration or expiration. And here's one of my favorite ones. In Hawaiian, ha means breath and spirit. It means both. And how the natives in Hawaii have a term. It's called haulis. It's the way that they talk about foreigners, in not a nice way. It's kind of negative. It's kind of critical. But here's what's really funny about that, is that haole literally means no breath. That's how they used to see foreigners. I know.
That's not nice.
No.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I have heard that concept as well, that the breath is literally our life force, right? So it is the connection between the physical and the spiritual. So I can imagine that pathway through breath work is incredibly cathartic and transformational.
Yes. And that's a beautiful way to describe it. I think the Buddhist monk and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh talks about it that way too, that the breath is the bridge between heaven and earth. And it's our most loyal and most faithful companion. While we're alive, we're in this journey of embodiment.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to just bring our awareness to the breath, right? It's an opportunity that we have in every moment of every day that can be a game changer, just bringing that presence.
Yes.
Definitely.
Changes everything.
Yeah. So you talk about the concept in your book of the soulful self, which happens to be part of the name of this podcast. So I love that. I would love if you could give a definition of what the soulful self is.
It's going back to that metaphor of the stadium and the baseball. To me, the soulful self is that part of us that remembers, that feels connected to it all. Because it's interesting that Ken Wilber, again, talk about when the evolution of the ego in humanity, like right around that time is when the ego developed in us, that at some point in human evolution we were at one with. We didn't have that sense of individual identity. When the ego developed in us, that was then mythologized all over the world, because that myth is all over the world of the expulsion from the garden. Because that was like the first split in consciousness, where we began to feel separate and alone from everything else. So to me, the soulful self is the part of us that still remains connected. Call it a soul, call it whatever you want to call it, the higher self, the different ways of referring to it. To me, it's that our own piece of sacred real estate, right? That manifests through this body right here, and that body right there.
Mm-hmm.
And once we are able to consciously pop ourselves out of that limited perspective of the baseball, then we can have those experiences that you were talking about, that we've been talking about, of feeling, the perspective of the stadium that feels connected to it all and feels part of it all. And then when we start living from that place, more and more, because it's a balance. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Like you were saying, it's not bad to have an ego, and we're in this journey of embodiment. It's a good thing to have a sense of individual identity. The problem becomes when we think that that's all of who we are, and that confusion is that when it becomes a problem. But if we realize that we are not that is just a function of us, a very small part of us, and then we can find that balance between being embodied as a separate individual identity and have an experience of feeling connected to it all, of not being limited. It's a whole game changer. That's when things happen that we can call synchronicity or miracles or magic, things that defy logic. Because
Yeah.
when we live from those places of the stadium, the reality of the stadium, it's like almost, it has like different laws, different physics.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where the differentiation comes between soulful power and egoic power, which is another thing that you discuss in your
Yeah.
book.
Yeah. And yeah, so let me zoom out a little bit, and start by saying that most of us have an ambivalent, conflicted relationship to power. We want it, part of us wants it, part of us is afraid of it. And I think what we fear at the core is that if we really stepped into our power, that other people wouldn't be able to handle us, and that we might end up rejected and alone. Or that if we really stepped into our power, that we might abuse it and cause harm to our relationships. And no wonder, all we got to do is turn on the news any given day to witness at least one abuse of power. And then add to that to that mix the fact that we've been conditioned to believe that power is a bad thing. With quotes like "power corrupts," absolute power corrupts absolutely. What they didn't tell us about that quote is that Lord Acton was speaking specifically about political power, not personal power. And so when you put all that into the mix, and when you add what we were talking about the fear of the emotions and running away from conflict, what happens is that we give away our power, our inherent, innate power that nobody can give to us, nobody can take away. We are the only ones who give it away. And the tragic part, the sad part, is that we give it away for lame reasons. So we override our preferences, our desires, our dreams, our beliefs, and we end up saying yes when inside we feel no, for an illusion of security, to maintain a false sense of peace. We settle for less, we play small for a false sense of acceptance, and for crumbs, for morsels of pseudo love. And so what the book talks about is like, wait a minute, we can understand why that works, how that is, but there's a way that we can step into power, personal power, in a way that doesn't have to be about hierarchy and control and fear and force and domination and manipulation. That there's a way that we can step into power in a way that doesn't require that we push anybody down, step on them, put our knee to their neck in order for us to prop ourselves up and feel powerful. There's a way that we can step into power that is a match, that is congruent with the innate goodness in our hearts. And so that's what the book talks about. How do we do that? And one of the steps is what you're asking, is beginning to realize that there's different types of power. There's worldly power and ego power, and then there's spiritual power or soulful power. And so for example, the world that we tend to associate power with, and from the worldly perspective, with people who have fame, who have money, who are part of some kind of hierarchy, whether it's a corporate ladder or a religious institution or something. But the thing about all those kinds of power, because they're external to us, they're outside of us, they're here today, gone tomorrow. Like many people are discovering, and with the pandemic, companies that just closed their doors and jobs that were just disappeared. And so, whereas the other kind of power is inside of us, like nobody can give it to us and nobody can take it away. And so whereas worldly power is arrogant and it's self-serving, it's always trying to get something for itself, it's always trying to blow itself up and seem bigger than it is. The spiritual power, the soulful power is humble. It's about service. It's about making a difference. So I think about a Gandhi or a Gandalf, from Lord of the Rings, in their simple monastic robes, their sandal feet. You would never know how much power they hold until it's needed. And then be careful. Like Gandhi brought the British Empire to its knees when it was at its highest point in terms of global reach, without ever landing a punch or shooting a single gun. Talk about power. That's power.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hear you saying that egoic or illusory power is all about controlling and manipulating in the external, having domination over others, whereas soulful power, true power, is simply being who we are and allowing the external world to organize itself accordingly, because we know that we are the stadium, right?
Beautifully said.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. And another topic that I really, really want us to talk about before wrapping up is your views on gender and masculinity. I think that you have some very important and groundbreaking things to say around this matter. You talk about patriarchy and how, yes, of course, it has been the cause of the subjugation of women for centuries, but how patriarchy also is detrimental to men. And I would love to hear more about this.
Sure. Thank you for asking. You're right. I think it's a really critical question for all of us to try to understand what's going on there. And so the book is for everybody because everybody struggles with power. It has a particular message for women. And that comes from my belief that the empowerment of women is the single most important thing that needs to happen in the world. It's not to idealize women. It's not to put women up on a pedestal. Women also abuse power. And it's certainly not to give women more crap that they have to clean up in this world. It's because we've been running so off kilter, so off balance as a species, as a world, between the masculine and the feminine energies.
Yes.
And so I believe that when women are in 50% of power in the world, we'll have a very different relationship to war and poverty and hunger and how we treat the environment and distribution of wealth, social justice, all of it. And it's those masculine and feminine energies, that imbalance is inside every one of us, no matter what kind of body we're in. So the balancing begins with us. And what you were asking about is that even though, not to minimize the price that women have paid over the last few thousand years because of that inequity, and still things are still very much off balance in terms of the power in the world between men and women and between the masculine and the feminine. But men are also paying a price for that. So the system of patriarchy or toxic masculinity doesn't work for anybody, including men. So let's look at a couple of numbers. The rate of suicide in the US, men commit suicide 4 times as frequently as women do. And 70% of the suicides in this country are committed by middle-aged white men. Interesting, right? Because that's the group that still holds the majority of the power in the world.
Yeah.
And what one would think is like, oh, right, the ones who hold the power are going to be much better off. But in some way, that's not working. Longevity, right? Women outlive men by 5 years in the US, by 7 years globally. What's going on with that? And I think part of it is because of this misunderstanding about the emotions. And we've got this limited and limiting way of thinking about what it means to be a man. And we, like, especially since we were boys, little boys don't cry. Why? Because only little girls cry. And because emotions are weakness. It's like, wait a minute, how twisted is that? It's just emotions, energies coursing through our body. And then the other faulty premise in that is like, to label the feminine weakness, It's like, wait a minute, you want to talk power? You want to talk the power of creation and the ability to be resilient and to withhold, to be able to hold pain? Let's talk about the power of creation that lives in a female body. And I'm not going to do it justice because there's nobody like Betty White. But I read somewhere or heard somewhere that she was being interviewed, and it was one of those group interviews where you have several celebrities being interviewed at once. And somebody said something about having balls. And she said, wait a minute, I don't even know where we got this connection about strength and courage with having balls, because you thump those little things and the guy bends over, collapses in pain. You want to talk you want to talk true. Power and strength. Let's talk vaginas. Those things take a pounding.
That's funny.
It's hilarious.
That's true.
It's
Can't
true.
argue with that.
It's true.
The metaphor speaks.
So important, in the same way that is important for all of us to understand the difference between power, the different types of power, so that we can own our power and stop giving it away. It's also really important that we understand the difference between the emotions, getting so that we can have our emotions rather than being had by them. From the subconscious. And really important that we get to understand and that we analyze why we have this misunderstandings about the masculine and the feminine, and idealize one and then minimize and lessen the others. Like, no, like the whole universe, the entire cosmos is animated by masculine and feminine energies. And, I know that it's a surprise to some humans, but we are part of the cosmos. So those same energies are coursing through our own bodies, both masculine and feminine. And finding that balance is key.
Absolutely. It is key. And I love how you bring in those numbers about middle-aged white men making up the majority of the demographic who commit suicide, which is very important, very unfortunate, but also very telling, right? Because that is the group that is seen as quote unquote the oppressor. And the truth that speaks to for me is that when there's an oppressor-oppressed dynamic, both sides suffer immensely, right? It takes a hurt person to hurt someone else. And that's what's at the root of all of it, right? It's all an extension of our own inner worlds on the collective level. So the most heroic thing that we can do, like you talk about in your book series, is to go within and face those demons and heal ourselves.
And it's nothing short of heroic to be willing to do that.
Absolutely.
And when we do, we empower other people to do the same.
Yeah, we get to be that example of how great life can be, right? How free it can be.
Magical.
Once we do that work. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing your work and for being the light that you are, for spreading the message through your phenomenal book, Awakening the Soul of Power. I highly recommend it to listeners. And I would also like to know, where can listeners find you, Christian?
Thank you, Chels, for those nice and kind words. The book is available wherever books are sold. So you can get it at your local bookstore. If you want to support them, you can get it on Amazon. In terms of how to reach me, probably the best way is my website, soulfulpower.com. And from there, they can access my social media. And for your audience, anybody who goes to soulfulpower.com and gets on my email list, and we know how easy it is, just click unsubscribe at any point if it doesn't work for you. But just by virtue of getting on my email list, they'll get a sample chapter of the book, which talks about what it means to live heroically in the 21st century. They'll get some power practices that are designed to apply those teachings and those concepts to our lives so that they don't stay at the level of information. We don't need more information. We've got information overload. What we need is transformation, and that comes from integrating those teachings into our lives. And so that's what those practices are designed to do. And they'll also get a short video that's a recorded meditation, teaching and recorded meditation about trust, which I created last year to help us navigate these incredibly challenging times that are just, there's so much fear and uncertainty and chaos that we're all going through. So thank you, Chels. Thanks so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And enjoyed the conversations and really great questions and deep questions. And thank you for having the show, because I know that in your willingness to do so, many lives are being and will continue to be touched. So thank you.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. Absolutely. And I just want to emphasize that I heard a lot of value being offered in exchange for a simple email address. So I hope people go over to your website. We'll link it in the show notes. And thank you to our audience members for listening to another episode of the Soulful Self podcast.